Hello, good day everyone. For this video lecture, we'll talk about measurement statistics, and how do we make sure that the measurement tools or the scales that we use for our survey research that we do in our social research are correct, precise, accurate, reliable, and valid. So the two main constructs that we're going to be discussing in this video lecture is on reliability and validity. But before that, we will also talk about some of the basic understandings that we have in terms of doing survey research. And then after that, we'll talk about performing a specific reliability test called Cronbach Alpha on JAMOVI. So, as I explained earlier, many of our research that we do in the social sciences, especially those that are quantitative, will entail some form of survey method, or will have or will entail using a questionnaire that people will be able to answer, and the questions in that questionnaire or the indicators in that questionnaire will be used in order to quantify whatever construct or phenomenon that we want to measure. So, what is a survey? A survey is a collection of information from a sample of individuals through the responses to questions. And the responses to the questions can be quantified, and then after it's quantified, we can do statistics in order for us to answer our hypothesis, or be able to describe the variables that are operationalized in our study. And like I said, in the social sciences, we rely very much on survey for a large collection of data when we are dealing with a large sample size. Now, it's also very important for us to understand that surveys aren't always perfect, and we always have to look at surveys very critically, like how we looked at our surveys during the election period, or for example, the surveys that are nationally representative, as the survey firms said, in terms of many issues, like for example, our ratings in relation to the government officials that we have, or for instance, the extent to which people would like to get vaccinated in relation to COVID. So there we see many results of surveys, and it's very important that we become very critical of them, and we have to make sure that they don't possess any error or minimize the possible errors, so that the findings of the survey is able to represent all of the people in the sample, or in the population that is being represented by the sample. And also, the survey also has to be able to measure what it's intending to measure, because if you have all this data but the measuring tool that you are using is incorrect, then the data itself is not objective, and therefore the data is erroneous, so we cannot use that data. So one of the common mistakes, or one of the common errors or sources of biases in survey research is sampling error. So we really have to be very careful when we are trying to represent the findings of our study, especially in the studies that we're doing at our department, because of feasibility reasons, we are not really able to randomize. We're not really able to really get the full representative population that we want to get. Usually when we do our sampling, it's really just convenience, and so therefore we cannot really assume that the data that we have really represents the whole of the population that we intend to represent, and therefore we have to express that in our research limitations. But for those research firms or survey firms that say that this is the pulse of the Filipino people, we have to really look at the methodology. Did they really randomize? And were all of the main regions and social strata of the country really proportionately represented? So that's one thing that can really obscure the generalizability of the data. And sampling error can cause what we call external validity issue, or this is a threat to external validity, meaning the extent to which the data that we currently have, is it generalizable to the rest of the populations. But in our work in the department, especially if it's undergraduate research, we don't expect you to get the full sample or the full randomized sample. And so we admit that in our limitation section. Next, I'll jump here, no, in terms of non-response errors. No, like for example, you filled out the questionnaires to people, and then you have a high rate of attrition. When you say attrition, this is the percentage of surveys that did not come back to you or came back to you with incomplete answers, especially if we're talking about a pen and paper survey. So that again is also a threat to external validity. But what we'll be talking about in this lecture is avoiding measurement errors, meaning we have to make sure that the survey and the indicators that we're placing in the survey, the way that we are asking questions in the survey, the way we are stating the items in our Likert scales are correct, and the content of the indicators really are pointing towards the variables that we want to measure. Because, for example, in the social sciences, most of the phenomenon that we are measuring are very abstract. Like, for example, when we say quality of family relationships, or when we say satisfaction with life, or when we say mental well-being, these are really very abstract and very subjective concepts that it's really difficult to grasp. So what we do is that we create measurement models and we create tools such as survey forms with multiple indicators that represent observable behaviors that can be reported by participants or respondents. And then from the quantifiable metrics that we have set for each indicator, we are able to kind of measure the phenomenon that was originally something that was quite vague. No? So we have here the reality or the phenomenon. And in order for us to be able to measure that phenomenon, we have certain measures that we use. Now, in the natural and the medical sciences, this is pretty straightforward. Like, for example, if the phenomenon that you want to measure is blood pressure, the main measurement tool that you use is a blood pressure sphygmomanometer or a blood pressure apparatus. If you want to measure the temperature, then you make use of a thermometer, right? But the variables that we use in social research is not like blood pressure or thermometer or height or weight. What we're using are really abstract ones, as I explained earlier. And so, therefore, the measurement tools that we use or the instruments that we use would be quite difficult. No, it's pretty much it has a different science. Not really difficult, but it has a different scientific approach that we use in order for us to make sure that the measurements are okay. Now, what are some of the ways that we do in order for us to avoid measurement errors? The ones that are most feasible, this is not a complete list, but this is what we usually practice, no, at our level. So we can do what we call a process called expert or member validation, wherein we allow people who are knowledgeable on the subject matter or in the variables that we want to measure, and then we have them take a look at the indicators that we are including in our Likert scales if we are doing Likert scales. So for example, if you want to look at, let's say, the perception of customers on a specific brand, then we have to look to marketing experts, no, in order for us to see whether or not the questions that we are asking really look into the perspectives that we want them to look at, no. So that's one. So what we want to ask the experts, or if what we want to establish for our instrument is to make sure that the indicators that we are placing in the instrument, in the Likert scales, are really measuring what we intend to measure, then we use then that's content validation. Content validation by the experts. Usually when we do content validation, we get 3 experts on the field, and then we have them, look at our comments, look at our indicators, make comments, make additions, make subtractions, or make edits in relation to how we state the indicators, and make sure really if that is contributing to the overall variable, no, that we are trying to measure. And then we also have what we call face validation. This is really more on the language that we are using in the indicator. So for example, we ask our experts, I'm going to ask this question to, let's say, an income poor individual, no, So, is my Tagalog version readable? Is this something that they would understand? Is the layout of my questionnaire, if this is a pen and paper questionnaire, is the layout something that's understandable? Will they not be confused? So that is your face validation. The third one is more on of a member validation, not really the experts, but more of a pre-testing with similar subjects. So usually when we do pre-testing, this is something that we do prior to actual data collection, just to make sure that the tools or the data collection package that we have is appropriate for the audience or for the subjects or the respondents that we intend to include in our study. So for example, if your intended or your target participants are students from your university, so probably you get 10 to 20 students from your university who will answer the pretest, and then they will make comments about the understandability of your questionnaire, about the layout of your questionnaire, about the appropriateness of the presentation of your questionnaire, and then you listen to their comments and then infuse whatever is needed in order to improve the questionnaire. And then that 20 people that you included in that pretest should not be included for the actual data collection. So that's the pre-testing. So just to understand whether or not the target audience or the respondents really understands what you are conveying in the indicators of your questionnaires. And then a more rigorous way of validating and reducing the measurement errors of your current instrument is to use statistical tools. And there are many statistical tools, but we're just going to be identifying some of them, but we're only just going to be applying one for our class. So we can either do a pilot testing for some of the more basic or foundational statistical tools. So pilot testing is just like pre-testing, but the difference between pre and pilot testing is that the similar muna, no? So the similar thing between the pre-test and the pilot testing is that you do this before actual data collection, and that you collect a small amount of sample for you to be able to see the validity and reliability of the tool that you're using or you're going to use, and then not use that specific sample anymore for the actual data collection. But the difference between pilot and pre-testing is that in pilot testing, you're going to not just consider the comments of the participants or the respondents, but also use some form of statistical tool in order for you to determine a specific condition or a specific characteristic of the tool to make it more statistically valid to be used as an instrument. And then we have full psychometric testing, and this is an actual full study wherein you're going to make use of many validation tools, statistical tools, in order for you to see whether or not this tool has construct validity, has discriminant, convergent validity, has test dimensionality, etc., etc. So that is a full-blown research, no? The creation of a new instrument is a full-blown research if you need to really measure social or psychological indicators. So the art and the science of being able to create measures for formal, social, psychological, and behavioral constructs is called psychometrics. So psychometrics is what we use in order for us to make sure that, for example, we want to measure variables like mental well-being, citizenship behaviors, or let's say quality of family relationships, financial well-being, and we want to measure that using a scale or an index. We use psychometrics in order for us to really see in all perspective if it is really able to measure what the specific indicator that we intended to measure. And this is usually done by relating it to observable measures such as indicators in a survey form that we see in certain Likert scales. So for example, this is the work of Farasi in 2018. They created a tool in order to measure the burnout levels of high school teachers. And they have here all of the indicators. So these indicators are the observable measures or the behaviors that all contribute to understanding the burnout. But according to the theory that, or the framework, the theoretical framework of Faraci in burnout, in order for you to measure the burnout, there are 4 dimensions. Just like in your citizenship behavior skills, they have 3 dimensions. So in order for you to understand the overall behavior, you have to go through the 3 dimensions. In this case, in order for you to understand or to really measure or gauge the burnout of a teacher, you have to go through 4 dimensions, which are personal accomplishments, strain, the personalization, and frustration. This is the results of a factor analysis. That is quite an advanced stat anymore. We will not be discussing how to do this in this class, but just so you know, this is a result from a factor analysis, basically loading the values based on the questions that go together or the items that go together to fill out the 4 factors or the 4 dimensions of burnout. So burnout, like I said, is an abstract or a social construct that's really hard to grasp. Now, in psychometrics, what we do is that we use observable indicators in the form of items in a scale so that when they go together, and if they go together well, they will be able to give us a sort of accurate measure of the burnout of a certain person who's answering that specific scale. Here are some of the major components of psychometrics, of what are the characteristics that we ensure when we are psychometrically testing a specific instrument or a test or a scale. So the first one is construct validity, which examines the question, does the measure behave like the theory says a measure of that construct should behave? So if we are measuring burnout, just like this one, is our scale really measuring based on what the theory of burnout is saying is supposed to be, what burnout is supposed to be, right? So for example, strain and depersonalization is one of the main key characteristics of burnout, and probably frustration and personal accomplishment comes up with context of being teacher, because when you go to burnout scales from general burnout scales, there are different ways of looking at burnout, but based on the theoretical framework, ito yung 4 na factors, so that's construct validity. Is your tool theoretically aligned? And is it really measuring what your theory says it's supposed to measure? So that's for construct validity. Now, there are 2 and other than looking at the theoretical fit of your validity of your instrument, you can also do convergent validity. When you say convergent validity, the degree to which 2 measures of constructs that are theoretically sound should be related are in fact related. So for example, when theory says that stress and burnout are correlated with each other, if I measure this with stress and they are positively significantly correlated, then there's convergent validity, right? Or if the theory says that burnout can lead to poor job satisfaction, right? So if there's higher burnout and there is lower job satisfaction, then they should be correlated. And then the opposite of convergent validity is discriminant validity. It tests whether the concepts and measurements that are supposed to be unrelated are in fact unrelated, right? So for example, we say that there is no significant relationship between, let's say, burnout and, let's say, burnout and, let's say, gratitude as a variable, right? So when you try to correlate them using the usual correlational or the regression statistics that we are using, they should not be significantly correlated for us to have discriminant validity. Because again, the argument is that if the theory says that this is a precise construct, your measurement should not be overlapping with the variables that they are not supposedly correlated with. So those are some of the activities, no, that we do under construct validity. Next, we also test for what we call dimensionality or factor structure. Refers to the number and nature of the variables reflected in a specific. So, for example, this is the burnout scale, right? And the argument in the beginning, in the theory, is that there are four factors. So you have personal accomplishment, strain, depersonalization, and frustration. And there are loading values here. And you'll be able to see which items refer to personal accomplishment, to strain, to depersonalization, and frustration. There are times that when you are intending to create an item, for example, when you create your own instrument, which usually I wouldn't. If you are not really into psychometrics or you're not trained, my suggestion is, if you have a variable, get a standardized tool that has done all of these things already, so that you don't really have to kind of go back anymore and do all of these very strenuous things, no? But if you are going to create your own, and if it comes to that, usually you begin with a lot of items, no? We call them an item bank. So, for example, originally this burnout scale is a collection of 50 items, no? 50 statements that all has something to do with burnout, and then you, as the researcher, kind of group them together. 10 for factor 1, 10 for factor 2, and then you have 5 factors, for instance. There are times after you've collected the data from respondents. By the way, when you do psychometric testing, this is not like pre-test and post-test where you have only 10 to 20 individuals. This one actually will need so many participants, sometimes even more respondents than an actual empirical research. No? Let's say you have 50 items times 5 participants per item. So that's the amount of participants you need in a psychometrics. Anyway, so when the values come back to you, sometimes when you do your factor analysis, it will return to you empirically as, it's not really 5 structure, it's a 4 structure. Or the items are not equally loaded. Some of them have more items than the rest. It's only the statistics that will be able to tell you that. So that's your test dimensionality. So some of the things that you have to think about when you talk about, instruments dimensionality, is it unidimensional or multidimensional? When it's unidimensional, it means that there are no factors within the scale, no? Meaning there's the variable is the singular factor. An example would be the mental well-being scale that we are using in our class. The second one is it multidimensional, just like this, just like the citizenship behaviors that were assigned to you, and just like the national resilience scale that we are using as a sample. So there are multiple dimensions. Now, when there are multiple dimensions, you have to do some form of factor analysis if this is an instrument that you made. If it's multidimensional, there should be robust correlations between the dimensions that suggest the dimensions are really going the same direction. So, for example, in this case, these arrows that you see here is a testament that these variables are correlated with each other. And then you also have to clarify the psychological meaning of the dimensions or the social meaning of the dimensions. You have to operationalize them and really make sure that they are all related, but they are different. So personal accomplishment has something to do with strain, but they are not the same. But together, they define burnout. Right? So that's very important. So we've done talking about validity, which basically answers the question, are you really precisely measuring what you intend to measure? Are the indicators in your scale really contributing to the understanding of the variable that you want to gauge or measure or evaluate or assess? Reliability, on the other hand, refers to the ability of a survey to produce consistent results when repeatedly measuring the same outcome. Ensures that a survey will generate the same or similar results across time and social context. So I'll give you an example so that you kind of understand it better. For instance, you want to measure the temperature of people, right? So there are different ways to measure temperatures, and there are different type of thermometers. You have a digital thermometer, but there are also different routes that you can measure the thermometer. So, for example, you have a thermometer, right? And then you have, although it's already phased out, you have a mercurial thermometer. And then you have a digital thermometer that you put in your body. And then you have a thermal, an infrared, right? That you want, the one that measures you when you enter inside. When you enter inside the mall, right? So that's an example of an infrared thermometer, right? So, and then there's also what we call a temp dot. A temp dot is something that is found in the States. You put it in your forehead. It's a sticker, and then it tells you whether you're feverish or not. Now, while all of them are measuring in degrees Celsius, you know that if you're going to put together the measures that came from a mercurial thermometer that was measured in the oral or in the armpit, same with digital, oral and armpit, and then you have an infrared, and then you may have a tympanic, the one that you put in the ear, and then you also have a temp dot. You know that whether you are measuring the same body temperature, but you would see that the findings would be inconsistent even if you're measuring the same person, because the specifications of each thermometer, of each tool, and each place in the body is different. Now, imagine putting that idea into your tool. It means that when the tool is used multiple times, it should be having the same outcome all the time, especially when it is a relatively unchanging social construct. Right? So that's an example. Or are the items really logically paired with each other? So the first in the validity, the question is, are the items really contributing to the understanding of the dimension, of the understanding of the variable? In reliability, it is more on, are the items consistent? Do they go together? Right? Do they something like that. Okay? And that is what we will be learning, no, in terms of the statistics, no, when we do the statistics. Now, there are different types of reliability. The first one is test-retest reliability, which involves testing and then retesting the same set of people on the same set of items to examine the consistency of their responses. So, for example, we look at, let's say, social responsibility, the pro-social responsibility scale. So, we understand that ideally, that type of variable, if you ask me yesterday and if you ask me 10 days after, the value of my value should not be very different. If it's very different, then there's something wrong with the way you've constructed the instrument. Right? So usually, for example, I have here my scale. I measure in day 1. And then I meet the same person. I measure in day 10. And then what I use is a Pearson correlation. And then I should be able to get an R value of 0.8 at least to say that yes, this is a fairly consistent tool, because even if time has passed, it is still able to generate the same findings, right? Or a relatively same value for every person. But test-retest is not good for all types of social and psychological constructs, because there are constructs that change immediately, you know. For example, when we talk about anxiety, when you answer anxiety today, pwedeng in a few hours, your values for anxiety is different because the circumstances have already changed. So test-retest is not for all types of variables, but really on variables that are relatively long-standing, like personality, or behaviors like social responsibility, quality of family relationships, unless of course there's something that happened within, right? Or norms or beliefs, no, perspectives on a certain resilience probably is a little bit more long-standing, no? So you can use test-retest. But this is quite difficult because you have to follow with the same person. For example, I have 10 people who I do my test-retest with, right? the same 10 people should be answering my on the 10th day. Okay? So next we have inter-rater. Reliability looks at the extent to which trained raters agree when using the same survey. So this one is our first surveys that are not that are not self-administered. When you say self-administered, it is the respondents who are answering the survey form. Sometimes when we do surveys, we answer the survey. An example of a survey is the one that needs enumerators is, for example, a survey on the community. Like, for example, when I used to be working as a development health professional, we usually go from one house to the next, and then we kind of quantitatively rate the hygienic state of the house, right? So that's 1 to 4, 4 being the most hygienic, 1 being the least hygienic. Now, inter-rater reliability means that the tool that you're using, if five trained raters are looking at the same house, the tool that you're using should be, generating the same score. But if, for example, rater 1 has 1, rater 2 has 2, and then the others are 4, then there's an issue in terms of inter-rater. There's an inter-rater inconsistency, right? So something must be done probably with the tool. What I would suggest there is that probably break it down into indicators, look at specific aspects of the home so that you don't just have to judge the home all by itself, right? Ano ba yung dapat hanapin if it's an observational tool? Next, and the one that we usually use and something that you might be doing for your thesis, and something that you use for your pilot testing is internal consistency that involves gaano ka-cohesive yung items in your scale per dimension. So this is what you will be doing also in your assignment. Do items measure the same concept or may naliligaw ba? Can they be logically grouped together? Okay, so the normal value for, and then what we use, the test that we use or the value that we get is what we call Cronbach Alpha. And the Cronbach Alpha should be 0.70. Now, sometimes the value will generate another set of values which says that if you remove this item, you will be getting a better Cronbach Alpha. So you can remove that item and that will improve the consistency of that dimension, of the indicators within that dimension or that variable. Now, why is it important for us that when we create our own instrument, is that we have validity and reliability? Because if the measurement is reliable but not valid, meaning, yes, the measurements are consistent, the inter-rater is good, the test-retest is good, but the construct validity is bad. If this is what you intend to measure, they will be clumped together, the values that you get, but they're not really referring to what you intend to measure or the reality or the objective reality that you want to measure. So that's problematic. Now, if it's valid, meaning, yeah, your indicators are correct, the factor structure is good, the dimensions are good, there's convergent validity and there's discriminant validity. However, it's not reliable. The indicators are not consistent. They're not cohesive. It's not easy to understand. Then the tendency is, while they are closer to what you intend to measure, the findings are not consistent. And so that's another, that is also a threat to internal and external validity. But if it's both valid, meaning it is measuring what's intended to measure, it is theoretically sound, and at the same time reliable, meaning the finding, the items are cohesive, the understanding of the items is the same for most of the respondents, then you'll be closer to the objective truth. Of course, you will not get it perfectly. Of course, there are many other threats outside your instrument that can, move the answers away from the actual truth. And, you will be learning this in your research class. Other sources of bias in your findings. But we're just talking about the biases that can be born out of the measure that you're using. That's very, very important. And so the parting message here is that when you design a research, it's quantitative, and you want to measure a certain phenomenon or a reality, you have to look with before you start creating your own Likert scales. The better way to go is to look for an instrument that has already gone through all of the rigors that I've told you earlier. Nag-convergent validity na siya, nag-construct validity, nag-factor analysis for the dimensionality, and then there's a proven. And then nagkaroon na siya ng Cronbach Alpha. Because at our level, no, based on our background, social background, we're not really, engaged in psychology for us to be training for being psychometricians. So we don't really have that skill for us to be able to do all of those things. No, what we're going to be teaching now, like in terms of the applied, for this session is Cronbach Alpha. But Cronbach Alpha alone is not enough. As we've explained here, reliability is not enough. It has to also be valid. So, I think you have to, so it's important that when you identify variables, it's good that you identify variables that have already valid and reliable characteristics. Just like the ones that I prescribed to you in the beginning of the class. The citizenship behaviors, the mental well-being, the self-actualization. This has already characteristics of a fairly good tool. And you can actually read the findings of some of the reliability and validity tests that they used in the journals that I provided you early in this class. So you can probably appreciate why we used them. And also, for you to understand that some of them were not really edited well based on how we use them eventually. So in this session, we learned about measurement statistics, we learned about psychometrics in general. We talk about the importance of reliability and validity in creating the survey. And then after this, we'll talk about how to do Cronbach Alpha using JAMOVI. All right. So I think we're already recording. So in this set part of the video, we're going to be talking about how to check for the internal consistency of your scale based on dimensions. So you're also going to be doing this as the first part of your assignment. So in terms of checking the internal consistency so we're going to use the National Resilience Scale, the one that we use for our sample for the presentations that I used with you. So the National Resilience Scale, if you remember, has 3 dimensions. So we have identification with my country with 6 items. So as you can see here, the 6 items. These are the questions, right? And then we have solidarity and social justice, right? Which has 4 questions. But as you can see, the expression man is wolf to man is characteristic of my society. This supposedly is reverse coded. So I also did a reverse coding for that. And then I have trust in public institutions with 3 items. Right. So we're going to make use of the values per indicator in a Cronbach Alpha test, right? For us to be able to check the internal consistency. Remember that you may be asked to do this in your thesis for the pilot testing, right? Kasi this is one of the easier tests that you can use. All right, so let's do this. All right, so where do you find that? You find it here in the factor. So click factor and then click reliability analysis. There. So what you do is for every dimension, you put all of the questions. So first, I'm going to just look at identification with my country. So I put all the 6 items here. So you find that, so this is the value that will come up. So that's 0.858. Remember, a good Cronbach Alpha score should be a 0.7 and above. So it means that it has an acceptable internal consistency. So 0.858. Now, there's also one command that you can do to have further insights, right? So you can see here you have Cronbach Alpha if item is dropped. So ibig sabihin dito is, for example, if I drop the first item under identification with my country, the Cronbach Alpha will become 815. So it will become worse. So I will not, no, because the original is 858. Sometimes you'll be able to see item values here that are higher than the overall Cronbach. So if it's higher, then you remove that so that the Cronbach Alpha will become higher. So this is our score. No, so let's put it in our no. So for identification with my country is 0.858, which is acceptable. Right? So next, let's move to solidarity and social justice. Now, look what happens if I just include the questions that are not with the original ones, with the reverse coded, with the negatively framed, not yet reverse coded. So Cronbach Alpha will already tell you na, it seems like as the third item is weird, no? The correlation is not the same direction. So notice now I will put the one with reverse code, right? So I will put here reverse code. So as you can see, wala na yung note kanina. But look at the Cronbach Alpha. It's less than 0.7. It's not acceptable. So now let's look at the item reliability statistics. When sabi dito, when you move SSJR3, when you remove it, the overall Cronbach will become 762. Let's try that. Let's remove SSJ3. It became 762, right? So what I would do here is that after the pilot test, when I remake the survey, I will remove the third question because it is messing up with the consistency. So for SSJ, it's equal to 0.762, acceptable, and then maybe just say that that item 3 was removed. So now let's try trust in public institutions. So it's 801, right? But if you remove TPI3, it will become 831. But I would, 801 is already acceptable. Although TP13 will improve it by 0.03, I will still not remove it because masyado lang kaunti yung dalawang items. So 2 items is too small for, really consistency. Anyway, 0.801 is already acceptable. So no changes are necessary. So I will just maintain it since it's already acceptable, even if there's a chance to improve it. No? So TPI equals 0.801, acceptable. And then no item removed. No items removed. And we'll also do that for identification with my country. No item removed. There you go. So this is what you will do for the first part of your assignment. You will do this for your citizenship behavior scale.